It's a real privilege to welcome Steve Blank as our speaker for today. Man who needs very little introduction here at Stanford, certainly has had a huge impact on me personally, so I may not be biased, but quick intro, I'll just cover four aspects of Steve. We'll start out with entrepreneur. Had at least 8 startups, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, really successful one was Epiphany, but had some others. And you look at any list of the most influential entrepreneurs in the Valley over the last several decades, you'll see Steve's names on the list. So real successful entrepreneur. I would say author. From his entrepreneur experience, he wrote a book called 4 Steps to Epiphany, which is largely credited with starting the lean startup movement, which he also had a big role in, with Eric Ries and others. And author just all the great defense magazines, a famous Harvard Business Review. The lean startup changes everything. Very prolific. Just look at the defense blogs lately. At any given week, you're going to see something Steve writes. Again, had some really, really successful and still impactful pieces, and there's more to come where that came from. So, yeah, entrepreneur, author, educator. He's been here at Stanford when he should have been hanging out on his beach resort there on the coast, which some of you who went there, anyone make it there last weekend? Okay, pretty amazing, right? Like, why would you drive over the mountain? Because he cares about all of you, and that's why he's here. So, amazing educator. Started something called Innovation Corps, which some of you have heard of, which was taken on and funded by the National Science Foundation and taught it. Steve, I don't know, what was the total number? Like 100 plus schools? I mean, it's a lot, right?
6 countries, 3 countries.
Yeah, so like huge impact.
NSF, NIH, DOE, NSA, et cetera.
Yeah. And look at Steve Blank's blog, because it's a much better introduction than I'm going to be able to give tonight in the span of a few minutes. You need a good hour to read it. So, and taught a wildly popular course here called the Lean Launchpad, which, students lined up and, still a very successful course. I've launched a lot of, the term "Get Rich You" for Stanford was largely associated with some of the work Steve did here and all the successful student teams that come through his classes. I've met Steve, I'd been in the military for a long time and was doing traditional security work, but met Steve, and it was a big life pivot for me, when we got together along with Pete Newell and built a course called Hacking for Defense, which, took a lot of his lessons from Lean Launchpad, and his methodology and applied it to a defense challenge, intelligence community challenges. Incredibly successful or effective and impactful educator. So what we got? We have entrepreneur, author, educator. And beyond hacking for defense, that scaled to hacking for climate, hacking for oceans, hacking for diplomacy. I mean, we are solving a lot of public sector problems with the work that started with Lean Launchpad and then it became Hacking for Defense. Last one I'll save is Patriot. So little known fact about Steve is, comes from an immigrant background, New York City guy. The saying, I said this before in class, you can take the boy out of New York City, but you can hear New York and Steve. But as a teenager, went off to Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, which none of you were alive at. I was barely alive. And so there he was hanging bombs off of fighter jets, bombing the North Vietnamese. So a real patriot. And that didn't stop there. I would argue what he's doing now is a real reflection on his commitment to public service and patriotism. He's on a lot of defense boards. He close advisor to the intelligence community, spends a lot of time in rooms with no windows that he can't tell people where he is at that undisclosed location, and extends beyond the U.S. to include our allies and partners like the U.K. So a lot of things. Steve, entrepreneur, author, educator, patriot, and friend, and over to you.
Thanks, Joe. It sure sounds like a description of someone with attention deficit disorder, which is probably true. How many of you sat through a couple of the week sessions? How many of you sat through some of them? So what you heard was, stories of entrepreneurs selling to the Department of Defense. Anybody interested in doing that as a startup? Anybody? One of the things I tend to look at now in my career is not only are those stories war stories, and war stories with quotes, meaning commercial war stories, is there a pattern here? That is there something you could learn and extract from all those stories? Is there a model on how to kind of learn from what each one of those companies was trying to tell you about their adventure in trying to attack the Department of Defense as a customer? Does that make sense? Yeah? And so what I'm going to do today is trying to give you some heuristics, some of the things I extracted from their conversation. and then see if we could kind of get some Q&A going for those who are interested in actually selling to the Department of Defense or potentially interested in doing that. I should remind you that this version of Silicon Valley and defense is only about 70 years old. We reinvent ourselves as a valley in our relationship with the DoD almost every 10 or 15 years. But what's new today is the fact that venture capital firms have stood up and started to just focus on funding companies either doing what's called dual use, which I'll explain in a second, or direct sales to the Department of Defense. And that is new. That's a real opportunity. The other thing that's really new is that for the first time ever, at least parts of the DoD have understood that they no longer own all the technology to deter or win a war. That's a big idea. It used to be for the entire history of the United States and other nations, the military owned all the advanced technology, right? Even in the beginning of the 21st century, drones owned by the military. Imaging satellites in space owned by the military. Signal intelligence satellites in space owned by the military. Autonomy owned by the military. The world's most advanced semiconductor labs, which they still won't tell you where they are, owned by the military. Advanced research in cyber, NSA. Guess what? None of that is true anymore. It's not that the military doesn't have advanced labs and all the services in other places. But in fact, think about how much, anybody know how much we're going to invest in Silicon Valley just in AI in 2024? Anybody, guess the number. Anybody know what that is? Take a guess. I'm going to cold call in a minute. Sir? 200 billion. 200 billion. Close, but a little of $50 billion, right? $50 billion. Anybody understand what's the total R&D budget for the DoD? A lot less than that. So think about it. Commercial venture capital is going to invest more money in AI than the sum of all the research labs in the Department of Defense. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to fall behind. It just means that the Department of Defense now needs to figure out how to buy things from commercial companies when they were never organized and still are not organized to do so at scale. That's kind of this impedance match that we're talking about. The DoD is trying to figure it out, and venture capital and startups are trying to figure out about how to have effective communication, and not just one-offs, but at scale. Anybody know what the MDAP list is? Anybody know what that is? Anybody hear that phrase? You got to go look it up after class. It's called the Major Defense Acquisition Programs. It's a list of kind of the tier 1 or top 100 or so things that the Department of Defense spends their most money on. How many startups do you think are on that list? How many? Sir?
0.
Correct. 0. How many should be on it? Right? Every year there should be more. That is, I think, the goal of Kath Hicks, but it's really hard if you're an incumbent prime where you're putting jobs in every congressional district and you're the major donor to every congressional campaign of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee and Appropriations Committee. So that's a real problem of an impedance matching between what's available on the commercial space and what the prime contractors have owned for the last 3 or 4 decades. With that, does that make sense as an intro? I want to give you a couple of heuristics or a couple of observations how I think about go-to-market strategies for startups selling to the DoD. Now, this is not the Bible. This is a set of heuristics, set of opinions, set of rules, etc., that will change over time. If you're a Stanford technologist, it's really interesting to differentiate your technology with problems and requirements. In general, no one in the DoD in general cares about your tech. The DoD buys solutions to real problems, and they buy things that are matching what they call requirements. They've already figured out the problems, and they've specified the thing they want. That's a requirement. The first question, if you're going to start a company that you want to sell into the Department of Defense, do you understand what these problems or requirements are? And I will show you a little later how to figure that out. But if you can't answer that question, all you have is a great set of ideas and a great set of shiny objects, but you don't have a company, in my opinion. If you understand problems and requirements, those lead to the quickest orders because you can find the people who have them, and they will eventually raise their hand, and you can actually talk to them and find out whether there's a match between their problems and your solution or what you could build for them. Now, in some cases, your technology may be seeing over the horizon, OTH, so I call it. No one has identified a problem or a requirement. It might not be ready for VC funding, but actually the Department of Defense has figured this out decades ago and has some really neat funding opportunities called the SBIR program. Every military service has what's called the SBIR, SBIR, which is free money. Seriously, millions of dollars of free money, and they take no equity. It's essentially a grant. And later in this presentation, I will show you which service has which program, and you could go online and apply for it if you're like pre-seed or in R&D, and you want to take your technology a little further. And it's a great onboarding for particularly Stanford technology companies. Make sense so far? All right. Selling to the government has no commercial parallels. Anybody ever been in business-to-business sales? Anybody? Couple. You know nothing about selling to the government, and I'm smiling saying that. It's not like you don't know anything, but trust me, I built a company and selling to commercial companies. My head exploded when I had to figure out how to sell to the government. It is the most unbelievable process in the world, and that's not good. In fact, the equivalent is for relative sales complexity. Business to consumer is like taking candy from a baby. And what I mean by that is, there's one customer, you could figure out what their needs are, you go do a lot of customer discovery, you figure out, here's the problem or here's the need, do we have what's called product market fit? The buyer is typically the user, it's not that hard. That's business to consumer. Make sense? Business to business is a little more complicated. It's like picking someone's pocket, right? It's not like taking candy from a baby, but there are more people, as we'll see, involved in a business to business sale. But there aren't infinite ways to do this. Companies are only organized in about 3 or 4 models, right? Companies are organized functionally, or they're organized by division, or they're organized by matrix organizations, but that's about it. There's not 500 different types of companies, and you could figure out not only what the organization chart looks like, but what the influence map looks like, et cetera, with sufficient discovery. But the government looks like this. It's really a mess. It's a mess and a huge opportunity. It's a mess because just figuring out where to start is hard. And it's a mess, as we'll describe a little later, is getting a first order from the government does not guarantee that you have a profitable and sustainable and scalable company. In fact, sometimes it's a trap. Where at least in these other businesses, you could predict whether this thing is a repeatable and scalable business model. In the government, much harder. And I'll explain why. And by the way, there's a kind of a fourth type of company called dual-use companies, which actually are companies that sell commercially and sell to the Department of Defense. Lots of opinions about whether this is an effective approach or not. I kind of diagrammed my view of what it looks like. If you're an early stage company, one of your biggest problems, that is when you first begin, is that you barely have enough resources to do one thing. And the sales process is radically different. The resources you build, the people you build, the go-to-market strategies you build are completely different in commercial and DoD sales. And so figuring out how to kind of do that all on day one is tough. Plus, some of the engineering requirements and security requirements for selling to the Department of Defense also have much more stringent requirements than commercial world. And also things like intellectual property rights and who owns things also differs radically. So I'm not suggesting you don't want to do dual use, but when you hear that phrase, don't just think it's some magic panacea. If I could sell commercially and then I could sell to the DoD all on day one. Paul Kwan, who's not here tonight, has a heuristic that says he won't let his startups think about dual use until they get to $100 million in revenue, and then they have sufficient resources to do that. Other VCs have other opinions. So I won't make you read this table. But later on, you could get a copy of these slides and see, here's kind of a summary in my mind of some of the differences. The sales processes are different. The types of selling is different. The types of individuals you need, their domain expertise is different. The barriers to entry, it's real easy to sell business to business. Selling to the government, really tough. Where do I start? How do I find out who needs what? How do I compete with like Lockheed and General Dynamics and somebody else? And are they partners or are they saboteurs or are they something else? How do I figure out what the criteria to buy something is? Gee, in a commercial world, and at least business to business or business consumer, that's pretty upfront about like, what do people want? But the purchase criteria for the government is sometimes quite different. Pretty stringent, pretty hard and fast rules, etc. If you ever think there's bureaucracy selling to large corporations, you don't understand the word bureaucracy. This is where you're all supposed to laugh. Selling to the government and the DoD, you will encounter one of the world's largest bureaucracies, 3 million people, multiple organizations, different rules, different like things you have to agree to, etc. Partnerships in the commercial world are for cost reduction, access to customers, etc. Partnerships in the DoD or selling to the DoD might mean you're working with gatekeepers like a prime contractor or a sub that actually understands all that paperwork, but basically wants to use you for leverage and then maybe, take all your IP and then like you're left in the dark. And then funding. It's relatively easy to explain to venture capitalists about a business to consumer or a business to business play. Here's one of the interesting things about selling to the Department of Defense and getting funded. If I'm a venture capitalist right now, and I could put money in a software AI company, what do you think the returns are I'm looking at? What kind of multiple do you think I will get? Sir?
1 to 20 times.
Yeah, like obscene is actually the right word. I'm looking for 100 or 1,000. I mean, it's just crazy. Now I'm going to put money in a company selling to the Department of Defense. What kind of returns am I going to get? Any idea?
Industrial multiple, I don't know, 5x.
Maybe. We're lucky. Why? You're going to go public? Is Lockheed going to buy you? Is Lockheed going to pay that same multiple that a software AI company could get? Probably not. So now all of a sudden there's kind of this impedance mismatch between what investors are looking at on one side of I could put my money over here versus I could put my money into DoD investments. The good news, as I said when we started, is there's now a wave of defense venture capitalists who are mission-driven, who are not as focused on 100x, but are focused on doing the right things for the country. Two of them are your instructors in this class, Ernestine and Paul Kwan. They both are investing in DoD startups because it's the right mission to do, and you get a return, but not at the same rate. Ernestine, is that a fair statement or not?
Looking to get good returns.
Looking to get good returns, but not the returns of an OpenAI or someone else. Just not possible. And we'll talk a little more about this. So the upside on a commercial company is unlimited. The upside on a DoD startup, limited, but not bad, but just limited. So let me remind you of kind of in general. Anybody want to start besides a DoD company, any kind of startup in this room? Anybody? Come on. No one in the middle wants to start a company, really? Here's a set of rules for whatever business you're in. You ready? Really important. Here's what you're looking for in customers. Do they have a problem? Or do they have a written requirement? If they don't have one, then you're just trying to throw technology into people who don't really care. Two is, do they know they have a problem? Seriously. If they don't know they have a problem, boy, you're now trying to educate folks. You don't have enough bandwidth and time as a startup to do that. You're looking for people who have a problem, and they go, yeah, I really have a problem. And the world's most perfect people who have a problem and know they have a problem, they've been actively looking for a solution. In the DoD, it might be special forces. Our lives are dependent on solving this problem. Or in the South China Sea. Gee, the odds aren't for us anymore. We're actively looking to change the multiplication force multiplier. Or in the Red Sea, we need something cheaper than just using $1 million SM-3s to shoot down $20,000 drones. And it'd be great if they already assembled the solution out of piece parts. We're using SM-3s to shoot down Houthi drones, but that really isn't cost effective. We're going to run out of those things. Gee, is there some other way to solve this problem? Make sense so far? But most importantly, for a startup, do they have or can they acquire a budget? These are the only type of people on day one, my opinion, that you could afford to spend time with in the early days of a startup. Doesn't mean in the mainstream you don't talk to other people, but the early days, you just don't have the time and bandwidth to be in an educational mode unless you're building something over the horizon. But if you think you have a product and service, these people exist. And I'll show you some areas where they do. Feel free to interrupt or ask questions as we go along. So, if you take this model of essentially, this is product market fit, that is, do I understand their needs? And do I have a solution that fits? Product market fit. When you're selling to a consumer in a business to consumer marketplace, there's essentially one person you need to worry about of whether you understand their needs. They're the user, but they're also the payer. It's a big idea. User and payer. One person. Sometimes there are other, but it's pretty low. Does that make sense so far? I don't want to go further. Product market fit in B2C. You see something online. You could click the button. You could pay for it. That's product market fit in business to consumer. If I'm selling in the enterprise, that is to other companies, well, there are multiple players. And I used to get this confused. Oh, the users really love our product. Used to make this mistake all the time. Do the users have the budget in the company? Oh, no, they don't. Who has the budget? Oh, it's someone in finance. Oh, well, there's another set of product market fit. I need to get product market fit that users care, but if the payers don't care, I don't have a sale. And there might be technical recommenders. If they don't care, can they say, no, this is a bad idea? That's another product market fit. And anybody ever sell something in the enterprise at all? Anybody? Yeah. Anybody know what a saboteur is? What's a saboteur?
Someone in the customer organization that doesn't believe in your product.
Yeah. And what will they do?
Sabotage.
Sabotage the sale. So there's usually another product market fit, right? There are lots of strategies. Do you steamroll them? Do you try to co-opt them, etc.? So there are multiple levels. They're usually less than 4, but you need to understand the real mistake is confusing the users love you and stopping there. Well, they loved us in B2C. That was a sale. Not true in the enterprise. You with me so far? This is a nightmare. In the DoD, at minimum, there are 5, if not 10 or 20 people who boxes need to be checked to actually get a significant order. Let me go back. So the question is, how do I find them? Where are they? How do I address them, etc.? Does that make sense so far? B2C, B2B, B2G. Now, what's interesting is Paul Kwan came up with a set of heuristics or a set of ways to think about the different types of strategies to go to market, which means start your sales plan in selling to the DoD. He said there's one model that starts, as Ernestine pointed out, that says, anybody have $1 billion? That's how you start, build it, and they will come. Literally, Palantir, SpaceX, Anduril, kind of almost household names, started with billionaires who said we could afford to beat our head against the wall for a decade until we actually get significant traction inside the Department of Defense. SpaceX, as some of you might remember, had to sue the Air Force for a decade to actually get them to allow them to build on national security launches. Palantir had to sue the Army to do that. Anduril, I think, had it a little easier because they kind of learned from some of those activities. But basically, the leverage here was private capital at scale to build innovation ahead of the requirements. They basically said, we think we have some good instincts about what to build. We're going to build ahead of requirements. We think we know. This was an over-the-horizon strategy. And we're going to reduce risk by also having a dual-use commercial strategy. Remember, SpaceX is actually amortizing the cost of military launches with what? What do they launch mostly? What kind of commercial? What kind of satellite?
Communication.
What's it called? Starlink. Right? They basically, so far, it's built, $6 billion a year, a business of creating their own commercial entity, which is amortizing the cost of the Falcon 9s that they're also developed to be reusable, which drove down the cost of commercial launches to a factor of 10 or less than the United Launch Alliance, which finally forced the U.S. Air Force to pay attention and now the Space Force to pay attention that this is insane to be paying these kinds of prices to ULA. And I finally allowed SpaceX to bid on that. Andrew has done this, but just on technology innovation about adopting autonomy and AI and other things much faster than a lot of the incumbents. This was a build it and they will come. But this only works if you have a ton of capital up front and you potentially could build a dual-use commercial business at the same time. There's another completely opposite strategy, which is bottoms up. To me, the three good examples are Vanderbilt Labs. I think we heard from them in this class. OneBrief and Turbine One. That's incredible functionality, so good and so clearly differentiated, it makes it easy to buy. This is like night and day from anything else they have online. You know, in the commercial world, we call this product-led growth. That's another path to selling to the DoD. There's another one where you use these advisors and these ex-agency government officials for top-down sales. Senior DoD leaders who can make the deals happen. Hondo Gertz or others who are now still widely respected inside the military, but they're now working in venture and in private equity. And then another one, radical collaboration. You partner with the primes. Instead of competing with the primes, you actually take advantage of the fact that they've been working the system. They have more lobbyists than you probably have people in your company. And at least in the beginning of your company, you use all their leverage to become a subcontractor and you focus on your core skills till one day you actually learn all the things they know about in actually operating in the DoD system. These aren't the only go-to-market strategies, but in fact, they're a good place to start thinking about what's yours going to be. Helpful? Yes? No? Okay. I just want to say this again. The government acquisition process is not designed for us, meaning Silicon Valley. It's not. It is incredibly complex, inherently unfriendly, trying to get better, but we need to learn how they work, not that they will adopt and adapt in our lifetime to work the way we work. And so you just need to understand what you're up against. I just put up this list. If you're going to start a business in the DoD, like the cost of entry is being able to not only understand the buzzwords, but actually deeply understanding what these processes are. There are lots of people who could teach you this stuff. There are consultants. There are classes here at Stanford, et cetera. But this is like the minimum of trying to understand acquisition. Eric, am I missing any on the list? Anything you would add?
Oh, just a few hundred.
A few hundred. Any core ones that are just missing? Yeah. So there's a whole, yes, there are a couple of hundred buzzwords. These are kind of the ones that popped into my head of like, well, I didn't even know what these meant, and these are kind of fundamental to even have a conversation about how the DoD buys and builds. So the way you get educated, talk to other startups and taking this class was a good place to hear some of their voices. But if you're in a specific niche or specific area, I would reach out to those CEOs. All of them have, excuse the pun, war stories about trying to sell that they'd be happy to share with you. Talk to VCs who actually have been in this space, are in this space, and have a portfolio of companies. Even if they won't invest in you, they'd be happy to hear about what you're thinking about. And in return, you could ask them, tell me the top 3 mistakes that startups selling to the DoD make. Boy, I would not leave the room until you learn 3 new things. And then talk to consultants. There are plenty of people who now are ex-military, ex-acquisition, who'd be happy to take your money, and some of them are actually useful in having you understand how the system works. And we'll talk about what a PEO is, a program executive officer, who actually manage some of these large programs. When they retire, they're looking for things to do, happy to consult or be advisors. There's something called the Defense Acquisition University that trains acquisition officers. Their website is open. You could look at some of their classes. At first glance, it is unintelligible and will blow your mind. These people need to learn this stuff. But if you dig deep enough, you could actually get some good tutorials on how the system works. And then, of course, take Hacking for Defense. MS&E 297, it's taught this quarter. Our final presentations are when, Joe? June 4th. You're all invited. At HR McMaster will be speaking at 5 p.m.
Yes.
And it goes to about 8 o'clock of the presentations of the final. And we'll show you some of the slides that the students have done to figure all this stuff out. Let me give you a taste of what you're up against. This is the simplified view of the Department of Defense acquisition paths. In reality, just even thinking about the number of contracts they have, look more like this, right? And this is just the simplified version of the types of contracts. It is incredibly arcane, complex, but eventually understandable. Truly, you could figure this out. But don't think it's like figuring out commercial sales. You need to get your arms around how does the DoD work. And I'll give you an example. This is an Air Force example. So there's something called program executive officers. The Air Force, for example, manages tens of billions of dollars, aircraft, other programs, etc., ICBMs. Each PEO, each program office is headed by an executive officer. They're a high-ranking official. They're responsible for the cost, for the schedule, for the performance, sometimes worth billions of dollars. And they report to the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for buying stuff called acquisitions and technology. And here they will actually tell you who they are. Here are the groups, here's their names, here's etc. Underneath each one of these boxes are sometimes tens or hundreds of people in their organization. You could go find them. And some of them will actually talk to you. And as I'll show you, some of our students do this all the time. Each service, Army, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, Marines, has the equivalent of these people managing large programs. That's one way to figure out where serious money is. By the way, here's another example. The Army has 1 million innovation organizations. This is a small map of the hundreds of innovation organizations that exist inside the Department of Defense. Here's the bigger picture of what the Department of Defense thought what was going on internally. They didn't have any idea of how many incubators existed in the DoD. This one's 2 years old, but there's probably 50 more. So innovation is going on all the time. They're buying things, they're testing things, etc. Your initial customers might be in some arcane corner of the Department of Defense. Typically at Stanford, a lot of students start with the Special Forces groups. SOCOM and other places tend to buy the most immediate things that are the things that will keep them alive another day, another hour, another week. They tend to be some of the earliest customers, but it's questionable whether that's sustainable at scale to build a profitable company over a long term. So the question is, how do you go from lily pad to lily pad inside the Department of Defense? So a success strategy, remember this, multiple levels inside the DoD. So in meeting with the government, one of the things we learned from Vanderveer Labs is if you don't have in one of your first meetings, not only the tech expert from the government and not only the user who's really excited because you've met with them, but if a program manager or program executive isn't in that meeting, the odds of getting a long-term deal, it's going to be a long, hard slog because it requires all three of these people to kind of agree at a minimum that you're something that they want to pursue in your first meeting. And I don't mean the first, but the first real meeting about talking about business. These are the minimum folks. And most people go, well, I spoke to the user. They're really excited. The tech expert loves us. And then you go, well, who's the people with money? I don't know. It's the wrong answer because you're going to spend a long time getting excited that users want you, not even figuring out that you're actually getting the program executives mad at you because you haven't even invited them to the meetings. Does that make sense at all? So the other thing to think about is right now there's lots of places around the world where the things Stanford students and others in Silicon Valley are building are needed right now, whether they're drones or counter drones or things on the surface or under the surface. But you'll show up and say, hey, I got this neat new drone or it swarms. I got this nice piece of AI. You stand in line. But if you could say, I actually had this tested in an operational field assessment, that is, one service actually allowed you to test this in a test bed, that's a whole different story. And right now, you're allowed to do that. If you have a drone or something else or some software, you could test your stuff in a real field environment called an operational field assessment and get a letter that says you can actually do what you say. That's a big deal in the Department of Defense. Example location, something called JFIX at Naval Postgraduate School. There's it's called Joint Interoperable Field Exercise, the Navy Antics program, and there's a whole list of test beds where if you have a real company with some real MVPs, that is minimum viable products or prototypes you want to test out or pre-production systems, you can actually get a letter that says we've run this thing in a near real environment and these folks are real. Make sense? It's a real leg up. Additional go-to-market tips. And thank you, Ernestine, for these. You want to identify trusted agents or advocates inside the DoD. You want to build a coalition. You really want to connect people who could link together, who might not otherwise even engage with each other, but you're kind of the connective glue. And you don't want to wait for them to connect. You want to connect them. The third part is, and this one I used to get wrong all the time. I got one group of users or one group really excited, great, I'm pursuing that path, and all of a sudden they no longer return calls. Well, what other paths did I have? Oops, I was only pursuing one opportunity because they said, oh, don't talk to any other group or we'll take care of you or whatever. That's their problem, not yours. As an entrepreneur, I'm telling you, you need to be ruthless in pursuing multiple opportunities simultaneously because one day, at least one of those groups are going to stop returning calls, either because they picked someone else or because they lost the budget or better or worse, they got transferred to a new job. Anybody know what the tour time is for a leader in a military organization? How long's the tour?
2 years.
2 years. 2 years. So great, you've been working on this startup and you're now 18 months in, but you forgot to ask, when does your advocate's tour end? And then you call up and they go, oh, he or she's no longer here. Who are you? Well, I just spent 18 months building that relationship without realizing that these people cycle through and anything they learned is ephemeral. So keep that in mind. In a large corporation, it's not necessarily that the last 2 years, they might last a lot longer. That's very different in the DoD. The DoD in general is used to a crawl, walk, run. They expect a process to prove the value in the field. That's why some of these field evaluations are important. And, the government needs the authority to have a requirement and a budget plus the authority to spend it. Now, the good news is getting validation in a war zone accelerates that. You could do it that way. And there are a lot of opportunities now, both in what's called SAG-U, the U.S. group and NATO group that's providing resources to Ukraine, and also lots of opportunities in INDOPACOM, the combatant command, that is the integrated service command that operates in the Pacific region. They are in crisis mode, where normally they would not be looking at things that are unfinished or buggy. Let me step back. Traditionally, the Department of Defense operates in things that need to be fail-safe. Life is on the line. Things need to work. And so the systems they built and do build are tested, evaluated. We think about 30-year life cycles, something called .MLPF, that documentation and training and manuals and whatever and testing all has to be complete. And that's pretty good for aircraft carriers and aircraft that need to launch and to live for decades. But all of a sudden, when you're in a crisis, that risk dial kind of changes. There's some places where you'll actually take things that are safe to fail, or at least that dial on risk might actually change. So, for example, if you would have asked Navy fleets, would you want anything that may or may not work? The admiral would laugh hysterically. No, everything absolutely needs to be fail-safe. Now, all of a sudden, with some of the risks they are facing, some of them might say, well, we'll take some risk that as long as this doesn't blow up in our face and we push the button and it only works 3/4 of the time, that's better than not having this capability at all. That calculus has now changed. And that's an opportunity for new entrants who never would have had that opportunity to kind of participate. Does this make sense at all? And so you could always ask that question of, how fail-safe and how much testing does this need to have to get deployed now in these critical areas? Kind of interesting. And it's an interesting opportunity. Now, everything I've said, anybody think they're smart? Anybody in this room? Come on. You all need to raise your hand. You're Stanford students, right? 100%. The problem with every one of you, is that the smarter you are, the harder it is for you to believe that you can't pre-compute customer needs. This one I've lived with for decades. The smarter you are, you're going to go, well, I get it. Good. We're going to build X or Y because I understand this. I read all about it, etc. That's not how it works. You need to get out of the building and discover this from first principles. Well, you think you understand it. You think you had friends who told you about it. Maybe you were ex-military and you understood this piece. There's no way you could pre-compute this. The government is not one entity. Local versus state, federal, DOD, different services, Office of Secretary of Defense, all have different rules, different acquisition authorities, different needs. And government customer discovery is all very relational. You know, your problem sponsor, the people you talk to, can actually help you discover more people. And let me give you some examples of what I mean about getting out of the building, given how smart you all are. I'm going to show you some slides from week 7 of a class of students who knew nothing about the Department of Defense on week 1. And by week 7, most of these teams, they operate in teams of 4 to 5, have talked to already 70 to 75 different customers, warfighters, stakeholders, etc. inside the DoD. So here's an example of a team trying to understand, you know, what are the mission sets and pain points? And so we make them diagram what they know and what they've learned. And we make them say, have you confirmed some of the tech? This happens to be some drone stuff. And we make them draw out what MVP would solve that problem. Here's another example. Show us who the influencers are and how will you get to deployment. Part of the key of what we teach here is that the goal is not a demo. Demo's great. Might get you funding from some admiral or general. Great, next tranche. But the goal is to figure out how to get deployment at scale. That builds a company. If you don't understand the distinction between a demo and deployment and what the path of deployment is, you get kind of a shiny object and then you go out of business. Because you got a couple of early orders and that was great, but nothing scales. What we're teaching students in this class is by week 7, figure out how we're going to get to something at scale. Here's another example. Show me personnel changes of what happens for this solution. Who was the user? Remember I talked about those multiple levels of product market fit? Who are the users? Who are the influencers? Who are the recommenders? Who are the decision makers? These students did not figure this out inside the building. They got out and talked to every one of these people on this list. Or here's another one. Trying to figure out embassy perimeter security. They knew nothing about embassies. They didn't even know where one was. Actually got out and actually visited some embassies and figured out local authorities, security guards, Marine Corps, RSOs, State Departments, etc. What were the roles of each one of those groups? Again, another one, trying to figure out, this one was trying to figure out where in NAVC should they actually be talking to, a branch of the Navy. Who in industry should they be talking to? Here's another one trying to figure out, though I have to tell you, a team that uses Comic Sans as a font, I don't know. But this was their trying to figure out what their influence and map looked like and what was the workflow of their potential beneficiaries. Another one. Does this make sense about, if you can't draw this, you shouldn't even be raising money. But these are Stanford students, knew less than you did. They didn't even take this class first. They were able to get out, use a methodology, use a single point of contact to blow that into 100 interviews in 10 weeks. So they could understand who are the users? Who's going to pay for this thing? How do we deploy this thing? What's the right scale? You know, does this really solve a problem? Or was it actually a symptom of something else much more interesting? The last thing I want to close with is fundraising. You should all know that every military service has an incubator. Air Force has AFWorks and SpaceWorks. Eric, raise your hand. Right? You involved with AFWorks? Did you help start it?
No, didn't help start it.
You helped run it. All right, help run. Navy has Naval X, Army has the Army Application Lab. All also offer something called SBIR programs. The DoD essentially gives away free money without taking equity, up to several $1 million in tranches, meaning phase 1, phase 2, and then eventually matching money with venture capital. Every one of those services has a web page. Go look up Air Force, Army, Navy SBIR program. The rules are kind of different. What they're looking for is different, but a good number of Stanford teams start here. Instead of starting with venture capital, start here. Kind of slower than starting with VC, but depending where your technology is, it's a great way to kind of do some more R&D before you leave the building. Eric, comments?
Not yet. I'll come in a second.
All right. Venture capital and government startups. If you're thinking about raising money from VCs, a couple of things to look for are VCs who understand what are the most pressing DoD problems, who owns them, and who are most likely or can acquire a budget. If when you're talking to VCs, they don't know any of this stuff, maybe you're talking to somebody who could write you a check, but I guarantee you they won't be able to help you navigate the system. You want to talk to folks who actually understand and could guide you through the multiple versions of problem solution fit. And you want to look for VCs where DoD isn't something they just added in the last year because it's now kind of a lemming effect. You want folks where this is one of their top priorities for their fund. And that to me is what I'd be looking for in a perfect world. In an imperfect world where we mostly live is take a check from anybody who would clear, where the check clears. But seriously, if you have an opportunity to be selective, find people who actually understand that world you're about to enter. Keep in mind also the primes have venture capitalists. I think we had Chris Moran from Lockheed this quarter. Chris is an example of multiple prime contractors, that is the large government contractors, also have venture firms, and they also have obviously deep domain expertise. And we also heard from Incutel, which is, again, the government's VC firm, and also has probably some of the deepest connections in very specific areas in the intelligence community. I tend to avoid and suggest to my students to avoid VCs who partners can tell you their firm's effective go-to-market strategies for government startups. Ask them for examples. Or VCs with lots of government advisors on their website who also can't provide just names. So make sure you're not being confused with big names versus actual actionable like help that you will get if you take money from that investor. There's also a whole set of grants, broad area announcement grants. I won't go through all of these. Instrumentation grants. All these are think of them as grants, free money without giving up equity, available when you're in Stanford to actually think about if I am a little too early to kind of build product but still want to advance my technology. Lots of resources from the U.S. government with this. So let me stop, take some comments from the teaching team, and take some questions from the class. Eric or Ernestine, anything you want to add, subtract?
No, this is great. This is great. I think probably one thing to note is I think the government struggles to keep up with the pace of technology. I think AI is a clear example of that. The government struggling to keep up with the pace of technology and what we're seeing with AI right now, where all the new innovation that's happening in AI, and there's no programmatic way for the government to buy and adopt that. So selling to government is challenging. So these examples are very helpful.
Right. And in fact, the government used to have the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, which was a kind of a center to help doing that. And it's now been integrated into something called CDAO, which is kind of think of the government's IT organization where AI is now part of that. But yes, they're having a hard time getting their arms around it, except for very specific things they're interested in. Great point. Eric, comment?
One of the things that I would talk about from the perspective of having been at one of the innovation organizations, AFWorks, was the immense excitement that we had about introducing new technologies into the Department of Defense. And that was a push strategy. The AFWorks has brought in more than 2,000 new companies to the Department of the Air Force. And then the trick, though, is to remember is if you're one of those companies, that's the push effort into the DoD. But the other side of it is the pull effort. And it's required with the SBIR phase 2s that somebody gets a government sponsor. But you have to work at that so hard to make sure that the pull happens. And so you get a lot of people who are so excited that they have these government contracts, and it's a big push, but without that pull, it's an incomplete thing. And that's still not a solved thing within this whole apparatus.
And hopefully you'll solve this for us there in the Gordian Knot Center.
Well, we're working on that. It's a big problem with a big need.
Right. And the other group I was remiss not to mention is the Defense Innovation Unit. So for those of you who haven't followed the DIU, just go to their webpage. They have announcements, broad area announcements of things that the DoD has raised their hand and said, we want, like folks in the Silicon Valley and other innovation clusters, can you help us with this specific problem? So they've already identified a problem and they're like asking for folks to come in. So look at the DIU webpage as well. Questions, ma'am?
I'd like to inject thanks. I'd just like to inject a quick geopolitical angle.
Yep.
We've got the we have the innovation and immense depth of capital markets on our side.
Yep.
Where do you stand on the question of how we can overcome the cost advantage that our key strategic adversary enjoys?
Well, it's funny, Eric and I have been talking about this. Eric, for those of you who don't know, created or helped create the Office of Strategic Capital, which is a way to create essentially, Eric, about $1 billion of new capital available for the Department of Defense to invest in other areas. What China did in 2015 or 2014 is they basically went to a whole of nation approach in basically harnessing their economy to their national security efforts. And if you notice, anybody been following the news? Anybody know who Russia just appointed as their Secretary of Defense? Anybody know what his background was? An economist. They're basically deciding that they need to have the whole country on a war effort. We've decided that we ought to go shopping. Seriously. We've not, in fact, the number of economists in the DoD, probably declined by about 20% when Eric left. Seriously, if we decided to harness the whole of nation, we'd be thinking about how do we drop a virtual $100 billion into the DoD budget by getting private equity to do things that the DoD's thinking that they're only doing by themselves. Today, if you talk to folks inside the DoD, they think the budget is a zero-sum game. I do autonomy, then therefore Huntington Ingalls suffers and they're threatened that they're going to lose a carrier contract. Or if I do X, the Air Force is concerned that we're going to cut the number of B-21 Raiders without thinking, wait a minute, there's a whole nother part of the economy we could actually engage if we thought about this of what kind of tax breaks would it take? What kind of incentives, et cetera. So I absolutely agree with you. We're doing a terrible job. And it's not about tech. I hate to say it's a lack of imagination, which we got plenty of in the Valley. Other questions? Great question. Yes, ma'am.
Earlier, I don't know if it works.
Oh, it kind of works. Yeah. Earlier you mentioned 4 go-to-market strategies. And I was wondering, as a Stanford student coming out of college, if you don't want to raise a lot of money or you can't, which one of the 4 strategies would you recommend or you think are the best?
That's like saying, what kind of ice cream would I recommend? And I'm only being half facetious. It really is a match of what are you building for who, and what do you think the best go-to-market strategy are they telling you would be most effective? So remember all those diagrams I put up? You need to start doing some of those of figuring out who are those users? Who would grab these things out of my hand? Whose eyes light up? Who would say, holy cow, that's the right path, etc. So if you have something in mind, a technology or a problem you want to solve, I would now be doing the discovery about who owns those problems. Is there a requirement for that? Or are you seeing something that they haven't even figured out they need yet? Happy to discuss this after class too.
Thanks.
Other questions?
There's more than just the 4 strategies.
Right. There's multiple. Those were just 4 examples of go-to-market strategies. Other questions?
Steve, maybe you could talk more about buying into programs of record. Just thoughts on that.
What do you have in mind?
Well, I think I'm thinking specifically on Shield AI in those cases, but it's also a bold strategy that is not your typical playbook. And I think for Shield AI specifically, they had, I would think of it like something that the government needs, but there's no way for them to purchase it.
Right.
So,
Right. So thank you. So part of this lack of imagination, or maybe a little more creativity, if we had some economists, there was an exercise called Task Force 59 in the Red Sea, where we used autonomous vehicles from Saildrone to actually run ISR, intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance experiments using drones for the first time as an integrated fleet experiment. But you know what? They didn't have a budget to buy the Saildrones. So you know what they did? They basically got Saildrone to agree they would provide the hardware, and the government was just going to buy the data. Contractor owned, contractor operated, government bought the data. Whoa, that was a new model. There are multiple models like that we should be thinking about how do we use new devices where the government doesn't have 3 years to kind of put it into their budget. But guess what? Saildrone is now kind of embedded in people's head. That's what you're going to use or buy if you're going to do those types of activities. That's one example of being imaginative about other business models as well. There's a question in the rear?
Yeah. When it comes to dual use technologies, which one do you put more priority on the commercial side or on the military side? Because military has higher requirements, but if you get through their filters, then seems to be easier to sell to the commercial side. Whereas commercial is easier to get in, but it also helps with the validation of the technology for the military side of things.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a business school answer, which is, anybody know what the business school answer is? It depends. But it truly does, because again, the thing you have to be careful of, not which is the right one, is do you have the bandwidth to do both at that moment? And so sometimes this is just an avoidance to pick a major. Because if you're going to go to military, at minimum, the whole sales structure of your company, there's no overlap at all. If I made the point at all, I hope it was, if you understand how to sell commercial, none of those salespeople are relevant to your military sales. For your military sales, none of that expertise overlaps with your commercial sales. So one, as a new venture, can you afford to have two sales organizations? Two is, as you mentioned, the technology requirements are going to be different. The security requirements for government sales are going to be at a level that just most commercial companies won't require at first. Are you prepared to do that? So that's the first conversation one should have, not whether it's chicken and egg, is do you have the bandwidth to do both, or are you just avoiding to picking the first one and trying to hedge your bets? And again, this to me goes back to the nature of a startup. If you're trying not to fail, then you actually are building a small business, not a startup. A startup founders actually understand that there's risk inherent in every decision you make, and you need to make some decisions that are aligned with, obviously, your investors, but you need to pick one. And then you could decide, I'm going from one to the other when I have sufficient scale. That's my opinion. It's not a fact, but it's my opinion. And I made that mistake a lot in my career, is trying to do everything without recognizing I need to have an opinion on what my vision is, have people drag me to within 10 or 15 degrees of the bore side of where I want to go. And then when I get scale, have more opportunities to make other decisions. That's my opinion of how I would build a startup. Other questions? I know we're out of time, so I don't want to keep all of you here.
One more.
All right.
I'll make this the last.
This is the best question.
Thanks, Professor. Good evening. From the venture capital perspective, how would you think through portfolio construction for defense-focused investing?
Well, the good news is I'm not a VC. And I'll start with, it's above my pay grade. I'm going to defer first to Ernestine. But remember, the space is so large, right? And you have to decide, are you going to be service selective? Are you going to be tech selective, meaning AI for DoD? Are you going to be autonomy for DoD? Are you going to have a portfolio across? Are you going to have vertical? It's almost exactly like a portfolio construction in the commercial space. Except, there's another thing to take into account. Which service or activity is quicker to market now than it was a year or two ago? And there are obviously places, particularly the Navy, but other places that both Ukraine and the South China Sea and the Red Sea are kind of accelerating adoption, where that wouldn't have happened 3 or 4 years ago. But when you're making VC bets, the question is, will that still be the case in 5 or 6 years? But Ernestine?
Yeah, well, venture is the asset class that's high risk, high return, and 80% of your returns are coming in from 20% of your portfolio, and things are shifting constantly. We have Eric here who set up OSC, and that's providing leverage for VCs now who are investing in the space. So it's a evolving ecosystem.
Right. Well, thank you. And I hope this was useful. Remember, it was an opinion. No facts were involved in this conversation, but I hope it gave you a feeling of what it would take to go to market. Feel free to show up at the Hacking for Defense class. You'll see what examples look like at the end of 10 weeks. And for those of you who are going to be around next year, we're happy to see you in this class and Hacking for Defense. So thank you.